Welcome back to The Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brian podcast. You are once again with Ian
and with Mike
as we continue our rereading of the Aubrey Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brian.
We are so incredibly delighted to be back. We'll tell you in a minute about what we've been doing and what we have planned for the show. But first, Ian, why don't we do this like we always used to? Where were we last time and what's coming up this week?
Oh, Mike, that's a great question. And it's going to take a little longer than usual to answer. Well, last time we had one last chapter of HMS Surprise. We filled that up with all the things that we love about Patrick O'Brian. We had Jack and Stephen headed for home. They were hoping to stop in Madeira to pick up their true loves. Stephen had attempted to recover from his dueling wound. Remember the duel? Diana and Stephen had decided, well, where do we go from here? In Stephen's case, that took him to a windswept hillside, weeping for his lover after he'd found a farewell note and his engagement ring that Diana had left for him in an envelope. Jack, meanwhile, had looked for action and a prize along the way. There had been all the usual great things, classical references, werewolves, misdirection, surprises. Yeah, surprises, pun intended. And as always for our two characters, no straight path ahead to paradise, despite what Jack had said at the end of the chapter, right, Mike?
Yeah, exactly. And that in the order of reading, going back to do our slow read one chapter per episode is where we were in the Patrick O'Brian timeline story. But it wasn't quite the last time that we recorded The Lubber's Hole. We did a lot after Surprise. We went through Persuasion, we went through the Golden Ocean, the Unknown Shore, and of course, the unfinished voyage of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, by the way. So 21. But we are today going to pick up our slower pace reading of the O'Brian novels with the next one in the canon. So hence the last time on HMS Surprise last chapter.
Right. So Mike, to do it like we always used to, this time, what we got this week, in chapter 1 of the Mauritius Command, Jack Aubrey comes to terms with domesticated life ashore on half pay. Jack is beset by caterpillars, wax-moths, a barren cow, daughters, and a shrewish mother-in-law. Not quite the life he imagined in his honeymoon cabin with Sophie. An old friend visits with surprising news. A lady begging a lift gets the Sophie treatment, plus Mike. Two old landlubber friends dust off their former identities and set sail again.
I wonder who they might be.
Now, Mike, we've got loads of great stories to catch up on here. We'll catch ourselves up in due course on the story of Jack and Stephen and on the story of Patrick O'Brian and on the story of the Royal Navy in 1808. But first, let's get caught up with the story of Ian and Mike.
Well, briefly, it's been over a year since we recorded and aired our last episode, and we've been busy with other things, including a hurricane I brought with me from Florida, moving to Western North Carolina, at least one extra grandchild, some new ventures in the world of work, and it happens a non-Patrick O'Brian podcast.
That's right. We turned our podcasting hands to production of a show aimed at people in our line of business, in management consulting. We had a fun time for a year or so doing lots of the things that we love, researching arcane knowledge, noodling on theories and chatting and picking the brains of distinguished guests. And if any of you did listen to the show that we did called Consulting for Humans, we really appreciate you. But Mike, that ran its course, right?
Well, it did. It did. We found ourselves just very much missing the old days of hanging out together in the world of Patrick O'Brian, and specifically hanging out with all of you, the listeners and supporters who gave us so much encouragement when the Lubber's Hole was first fully underway, those first 4 years.
Right. So, having succumbed to the temptation of talking endlessly about our favorite author in company with our favorite bunch of listeners and trying to set aside the old theory that it's never as good as the first time, here's what we plan to do. We're going to pick up roughly where we left off, just like we just set it up for you. Chapter 1 of the Mauritius Command, covered at the slower pace of one episode per chapter. We are going to pace ourselves a little. Producing one whole episode per week was, looking back on it, a bit of a stretch for all kinds of reasons. So we're going to produce one episode every 2 weeks For British English speakers, that's one episode per fortnight, meaning that covering this book is going to last us a number of months for the time that we'll spend with you all here. Now, if all of us are enjoying the experience and the reunion works out and it is as good as last time, then who knows, at some point we'll move on to Desolation Island and give that the deeper Lubber's Hole treatment. And yeah, as several of you have reminded us on social media over the last year, we do owe you those 5 books at the slower pace.
So thanks for being on board with us, and let's get started. The first catch up that we promised you and promised ourselves was on Patrick O'Brien. What was going on in his world, Ian?
Well, Mike, we look back at what we know about the biography of O'Brien, and this was a kind of odd time for him. Up until the publication of the Mauritius Command, which was in 1977, he had a number of interesting new things happening. He had a major biography project that we'll talk about. He had a bit of a hiatus, actually, from writing the Aubrey Maturin series, and he had begun rather belatedly to get recognized from the British literary establishment. So this hiatus, as I said, was 4 years, a 4-year gap between the publication of HMS Surprise and the publication of the Mauritius Command. And that hiatus was filled by a significant non-fiction endeavor, namely writing a biography of Pablo Picasso.
Yeah, and at this time, he didn't have a contracted publisher in the U.S. for his Aubrey Maturin series. His first publisher had stopped publishing, and he also had seen some critics challenge the idea that O'Brien had now eclipsed Forrester. So given all this, he could, I think, be forgiven for indulging in this charming distraction of Picasso here.
Yeah.
That distraction came when Bill Targ, a senior editor at Putnam, approached him to write this biography of Picasso, a project that came with, as the biographer says, a generous budget. O'Brien accepted the commission shortly before Picasso died on April 8th, 1973.
Now, this seemed to have really lit a bit of a light bulb for O'Brien, seeing himself at the heart of the cultural life of, Europe and the world, and especially with the connection to the Mediterranean coast where Picasso was from. So he got to work at full throttle researching Picasso's life. O'Brien and his wife Mary traveled far and wide doing first-hand research. They toured Spain. They combed Picasso's childhood regions, which were in Catalonia, which was close by for them. They went to Paris. They went to the Soviet Union. They went to the United States to view paintings and interview contacts. And O'Brien, therefore, brought quite a personal perspective to the book. The book, published in 1976, entitled Pablo Ruiz Picasso, A Biography, was really dense. Dean King says it contains a stupendous amount of factual material and in-depth analysis, and that seems to be an underestimate. It was not, to be honest, a commercial success, certainly not in the United States. It sold well outside the US. The famous British art historian Sir Kenneth Clarke thought it was the best biography of Picasso, and that seemed to be a big achievement, right?
Yeah, and D.T. O'Brien's biographer reports that after the completion and submission of the revised Picasso manuscript, O'Brien eagerly returned to the Aubrey Maturin series. And we'll come back later on to talk about the impact that the Picasso project might have had on O'Brien's approach to his next Aubrey Maturin story. And speaking of which...
Right, for the 4th novel, O'Brien chose to go back to a formula he'd used before, which was to turn to the real history and dispatches of the Navy. He focused on the intriguing set of actions, as he called it, that comprised the historical Indian Ocean campaign of 1809 to 1810, focusing on the battle for control of Mauritius. This provided the factual core around which he would structure this novel, The Mauritius Command. As I said, very similar to the way Master and Commander was built around the core of Thomas Cochrane's famous cruise of 1801. And we'll come back to this comparison of the two worlds later on.
And O'Brien gathered a lot of specialized information from the novel. He'd never visited the Cape of Good Hope. He requested details about the geographic features visible from the sea from his friend and historical novelist Mary Renault, who lived in Cape Town, and sent him pictures and postcards.
So, with the help of all of this research, he delivered this new novel, The Mauritius Command, to Richard Allard, the editor, in September 1976. Just a year, barely a year after he'd finished the Picasso book. Allard strongly endorsed the book to the management of the publishing house, called it a first-class Jack Aubrey story in point of construction, perhaps the best we have ever had. And that's going to be an interesting thing for us to debate, Mike. This book seems to me to split the room a little bit. There are some people who are super deep fans of Mauritius Command, and some people who go, no, I could take it or leave it. But it's interesting to look at how come that is. He had, in fact, dedicated the Mauritius Command to Mary Renault. The inscription at the beginning in Greek, in a typical Patrick O'Brien bit of scholarship, refers to an owl to Athens, meaning this book is something taken superfluously to somebody who already has lots of knowledge. He's basically saying that dedicating a book to her was redundant as dedicating snow to Eskimos.
I love this friendship between Renault and O'Brien here, because she was a massive figure at the time, and he in historical fiction not so much so. And boy, she gave him a great, talk about the importance of author's blurbs. She gave him a great one. Well, just as with the first three novels, O'Brien's writing continues to be informed by his vast reading of classical writers' naval history sources, including the Naval Record Society and the Naval Chronicle, and other authors such as Chaucer and Johnson and Austen, Dickens, even, all of which we'll get into as we turn the pages of this book. But, Ian, what about Jack and Stephen?
Well, Mike, it's been so long. And also, we might have people listening who haven't been with us closely on the journey so far. So let's take a moment. Forgive us if this is not news to you, but we'll just take a few moments here to backtrack into the first part of the story arc of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin. Way back in the first book, Master and Commander, Jack had taken command of the brig sloop Sophie, and he'd had success in taking merchant prizes, which quickly earned him the nickname Lucky Jack. Stephen Maturin, meanwhile, an Irish physician and naturalist, had accepted the post of ship's surgeon alongside Jack. Giving us a clue about his future clandestine character, Stephen had been involved in mediating the conflict aboard the Sophie between Jack and his first lieutenant, James Dillon, another man of Irish extraction who had been involved in the 1798 rebellion involving the United Irishmen. In the first climactic action of Master and Commander, Jack had boarded and captured the Spanish Xebec frigate Cacafuego, which we're going to hear mentioned a few times. That action led to the death of James Dillon. The Sophie was later captured by a powerful French squadron following a fleet action off of Gibraltar. Then Jack and Stephen were back in the Navy's good books. That wrapped it up for Master and Commander. What happened next, Mike?
Well, then we go to Post Captain. So a very different novel, but with absolutely Jack and Stephen running through very consistently. They returned to England during the temporary peace of Amiens. They settled in Hampshire, met the women of the extended Williams family, and things got complicated as Stephen fell for Diana Villars, and Jack became, shall we say, close with both Diana and her cousin Sophie. The story was further complicated by Jack's conviction for debt and ready to be arrested, but the two men fled to France just as war broke out in 1803. Bear suit. And then after which they found their way home, with Jack taking command of the unusual experimental sloop HMS Polychrest. Now, this was a different turn, very Jane Austen-esque, but also some real tension with Jack and Stephen almost dueling over Diana. But there was a very desperate action at the end, which saw the loss of the Polychrest and the reconciliation of our two heroes, these two friends. And then Stephen found a way for Jack to participate in the capture of the Spanish treasure fleet in October 1804. So this might be, we could say, the beginning of Stephen's fairy godmother days. We'll get back to that here in a minute.
Finally, in the third book, HMS Surprise, Jack had remained heavily in debt because of various financial complications from his prize-taking history. Stephen had been accidentally exposed as a spy, resulting in him being captured and tortured at the hands of the French. And after rescuing his friend, Jack was given command of the frigate HMS Surprise for a mission to the East Indies and to the South China Seas. And in the Indian Ocean, the Surprise had protected the China merchant fleet. In India, Stephen fought a duel with Diana's lover, name of Canning. Jack sailed homeward, arranging to meet Sophie at Madeira and for them to marry once they reached England. For his part, Stephen had given Diana a ring and hoped to meet her in Madeira as well. But as we already heard, on the windswept mountainside, he learned that Diana had departed for America with a guy called Harry Johnson, a rich man she intended to marry, in preference to Stephen. So, Mike, that's how O'Brien had left things at the end of HMS Surprise. Do you want to just give us the final quote from HMS Surprise to put us in O'Brien mode here as we get started?
Yeah, we talked so many times about how sometimes you just sort of turn one page to end a novel and you turn the next and you're right back where you started. Well, here's where we left off at the end of HMS Surprise. O'Brien wrote, "They came on deck. Jack called for a bosun's chair to be rigged, and while it was preparing, Stephen and Sophie waved to one another without a pause, smiling and crying out, 'How are you, Stephen? How are you, my dear?' And Jack turns to Heneage Dundas and says, 'I'm so very much obliged to you, so deeply obliged. Now I have but to run Sophie and my treasure home, and the future is pure paradise.' So let's turn the opening pages of the Mauritius Command and see how things lie."
Let's. Oh, Mike, it's great to be here. I don't want to say, you and I have been saying this over and over to each other for the last several days and weeks. It's great to be here. Here we are, page 1, chapter 1, the Mauritius Command, and we get acquainted with a very new situation. It's not turn the page over and we're in the immediate next step of the timeline. Things have moved along. Jack Aubrey is living in Ashgrove Cottage in Hampshire. Previously known, as we'd already said, as Lucky Jack because of his financial success, he now seems to be down on that luck. He is without a ship. He's reduced to half pay of 9 shillings a day. All of this due to the failure of his agent, due to his ignorance of business, and the sharp practice of an attorney. And Mike, the sharp practice of the attorney is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. There's O'Brien giving a great hint about a very detailed and convoluted story in just a few words, right?
Yeah, he is. Just amazing how he does this. His domestic life, which O'Brien paints in great detail, is one of intense discomfort, financial strains. The cottage, though pictured in Jack's mind as this romantic, wonderful paradise to come, and may have started out a little bit of that way with Sophie and Jack, is certainly far from what it was originally in Jack's mind at sea. It's described as low-ceiling, pokey, and inconvenient, and it's severely overcrowded. Not just Jack and Sophie, but their twin infant daughters, Charlotte and Fanny, born after what was described as a very long and complicated confinement for Sophie, a niece, Cecilia, and Sophie's now bankrupt mother-in-law, Mrs. Williams, as well as some huge pieces of furniture that Mrs. Williams has decided to bring along to this tiny little cottage from her past home, Mapes, that serve absolutely no purpose here. Now, the damp conditions and overcrowding lead Jack to compare the home to the Black Hole of Calcutta, except, and this is just classic O'Brien, he writes that whereas the hole was hot, dry, and airless, Ashgrove Cottage let in draughts from all sides, and while the damp rising from the floor joined the leaks in the roof to form pools in many of the rooms. So, Ian, Black Hole of Calcutta. This is one of many phrases that O'Brien drops here. Tell us a little bit about where's this come from?
Well, it's both a cute bit of English kind of folk history and a little pointer to some of the places that we've been in the past. The Black Hole of Calcutta was a dungeon in the British enclave of Fort William, Calcutta, which was where the Nawab of Bengal had imprisoned some British prisoners of war in 1756. And the incident of the Black Hole of Calcutta is controversial. One account claims that 123 out of 146 prisoners died from suffocation and heat in this small dungeon. Modern historians say, well, maybe it was a lot less than that. And maybe as few as 18 people finally died. But the event was used by the British as propaganda to justify their military action against the Nawab, and that led to the Battle of Plassey in 1757, another one of the long list of very discreditable battles fought by the British colonizers against the local Indian rulers. And the phrase is used, at least by British English speakers of a certain age, to describe somewhere dark and unappealing. So maybe in my parents' generation, a parent might have said that they declined to enter a teenager's bedroom to tidy it up because, as you might say, it's like the black hole of Calcutta in there. Now, Mike, that's the black hole of Calcutta. We had this word dropped in as well about Sophie and childbirth, calling it confinement. That's kind of an archaic word, right?
Well, it is. There was a time when pregnancy was thought to be such a fragile state that a woman should be, quote unquote, confined to her house, and was indeed that. Now, these days that word lies beneath the medical abbreviation of EDC. So if you ever see your due date, if you're pregnant, you've got an EDC. EDC is actually short for estimated date of confinement. That's where that came from. And so we know in Sophie's case, that had a lot more than just the time she spent confined to her house and probably to her bed. And it's O'Brien planting a little thing that pays off later in this discussion about where Jack and Sophie's relationship is currently here.
It's great, isn't it? He's also planting a little bit for us about Jack's state of mind. We've already mentioned that he has only 9 shillings a day to look after this now bigger establishment with their mother-in-law and their daughters and the niece. And O'Brien says, the effort of doing so had imprinted an expression of abiding worry on a face that nature had meant to look cheerful, an expression that sometimes had a touch of frustration in it as well. For Captain Aubrey, a scientific as well as a natural-born sailor devoted to hydrography and navigation, was deeply concerned with a plan for finding the longitude at sea by the moons of Jupiter. And we go on to talk about how Jack was grinding his own telescope mirrors and he was spending a guinea or two at a time on brasswork. Now, this is potentially a whole other field of distraction and trouble for Jack Aubrey that we might have to get back to in a later chapter, Mike. But this is clearly Jack not sitting easily and comfortably with life at home, right?
No, you're absolutely right, Ian. And you've mentioned something. There's about 2 chapters worth of chapter in chapter 1. And rather than doing okay, welcome back, we're going to split this into 2 halves. We're going to do it all here, but you're going to find us, skipping some stuff and touching on some stuff and perhaps coming back later down the road here. So you're talking about Sophie, though she still possesses a lovely face. She now wears a somewhat anxious look. Now, some of the writing reflects that perhaps this is her status as a sailor's wife who knows her husband's temporary shore duties commanding the local sea fencibles must end soon. That would be one woman's way of looking at it. Or perhaps this is Sophie. We know Sophie. We know Jack a little bit, and the chapter will play out, dreading that they, in fact, may not end soon enough. Sophie knows that Jack loves being at sea and longs to be at sea. So here's this tension going on. I don't want to lose him, but then again, I want him to be happy here.
Right. Well, who could we hope for, or even what could we hope for that might break poor old Jack and Sophie out of this mutually dependent, mutually burdensome logjam? Step forward, Stephen Maturin. Stephen Maturin has recently been in Spain, and he arrives what seems like for the first time in a very long time at the cottage visiting with Jack and Sophie. He finds Jack in the observatory, and we get a bit more about Jack's interest in astronomy and navigation. Stephen and Sophie are each kidding themselves a little bit about what this means and about what they think about how Jack is doing. Stephen, though, looks Jack in the eye and is shocked by the change in his friend. He's shocked by the anxiety, the marks of age and unhappiness on his face. Another quote here, Stephen Maturin had thought of Aubrey as powerful, resilient, cheerful, youth itself, for so long that this change and the slow, weary motion as the distant figure closed the instrument and stood up, his hand pressed to an old wound in his back, were unusually distressing. And Mike, we know, because on previous episodes, we've talked all the way through the canon about how O'Brien portrays both men's preoccupation with aging, Jack in particular. And we're just getting introduced to this idea that Jack is mortal and he's vulnerable and he's going to get infirm and old steadily, perhaps more quickly than he might be happy with. But this is, even so, with this kind of sadness about age and time passing, it's still a happy moment, right?
Well, it's so awesome. I just love their reunion. Stephen, cries Jack, shooting out backwards with surprising nimbleness in so large a man and seizing his friend by both hands. His pink face was scarlet with pleasure, and a slight answering flush appeared in Matron's. How very happy I am to see you, old Stephen. So, we've got this whole beginning of this chapter like, oh my gosh, is there anything right in the world? And bam, here it is. The two particular friends together again. This definitely right in the world.
And a little bit of O'Brien visual imagery. He's very sparing with this, but when he does it, it's great, isn't it? It's been cold. It's been kind of green and blue so far in this chapter, but these two are together and we have redness and pink and joy and warmth. Oh, it's great. And Mike, I like the way that this domestic situation is portrayed by O'Brien as well. It's funny and tragic simultaneously. As we've said, this is very far from a pure paradise. And Stephen had already alluded to this when he first saw Jack and asked if Jack had asked if Stephen hadn't seen Sophie yet. Stephen's response was that he had paused at the kitchen door, and hearing domestic sounds within, the massacre of the innocents came to my mind. I merely left my offering and my horse and came along. So Stephen's observing all of this with his tongue firmly in his cheek. Now, he mentions the massacre of innocents, Mike. That's a quotation. Should we dig into that?
Well, yeah, I think absolutely, because, I think it would be easy to trip over and go, the massacre of innocents came in mind. Well, I have no idea. What is he talking about? The massacre of the innocents is a biblical event described in the Gospel of Matthew alone. Matthew chapter 2, 16 to 18. So the Magi, the wise men, we've just come through a season, when we're recording
By the way, today is Epiphany as we're recording this, Mike. So that's
exactly. Well put, Ian. Exactly right. This is exactly the Magi are visiting the Christ child today in our calendar recollection. Well, before they got there, they went to visit King Herod the Great to say, hey, the Savior is going to be born here close by. And Herod's like, oh, this is wonderful. The Messiah is coming. I want you to come back and tell me where the Messiah is so I can go worship the Messiah. Well, they're warned, and so they sneak out. They don't go back and tell Herod. Herod is pretty upset by this. And so he orders the execution of all male children aged 2 and under in Bethlehem to eliminate the threat to his crown, from this newborn child. So it's like, okay, just to be sure, let me take out all kids from 0 to 2 in this town of Bethlehem where they said he was going to be born. That is the massacre of the innocent. So when Stephen has this casual remark about, well, I heard what was going on inside your house, this to me was like, oh my gosh, that's pretty strong stuff.
Right. And he's planting something here about gender and children and family being important. Guess what? That's not a coincidence. You could say, Mike, that in this, especially this middle part of the chapter, there's a whole field of, as you could say, plants being set in the ground, awaiting payoffs. Maybe now in this chapter, maybe later on. The first one that I noticed was Jack saying that he can see that the cat, the flogging whip, he can see that the cat has uses ashore that he wouldn't countenance at sea. And Jack, we know, is not a friend to corporal punishment, but all of a sudden, in family environments, he's suddenly become to realize the power of being able to give somebody a quick 5 lashes or so. We're going to see a couple of different faces of corporal punishment in this story in later chapters. And Jack later on, I think, would not like to be reminded of this kind of lighthearted throwaway remark about being a friend to the cat back here in chapter 1. There's another great plant as well coming at the end of the chapter, but I'm going to save that one for later.
Well, we've talked about O'Brien and visual metaphors and play with light and perspective. He did so much of that in HMS Surprise. I mean, even the very opening of the book so beautifully. And so Jack and Stephen in this one, somewhat implausibly, if you look at the actual location they're supposedly sitting on, are using a telescope to spy on the ships in Portsmouth Harbor. And poor Jack, frustrated with his love of astronomy and his idea about aiding the sailors' navigational abilities, is now reduced into becoming sort of a naval peeping Tom. So right now it's not elevated toward the stars. It's right down into the harbor here.
Right. And they're both slightly unreliable witnesses to and for each other. Stephen is told that he's looking through the lens at HMS Caledonia, and he says, oh yes, I can see the Scotch arms. And I think that's actually quite unlikely. A bit of wishful thinking on Stephen's part, grasping for the fact that the name Caledonia means Scotland. There was indeed a ship called the Caledonia. She would have been a very new ship of the line at the time. In fact, the biggest and the most heavily armed ship in the Navy in 1808. But she wouldn't have carried Scottish insignia. That, St. Andrew's Cross, the saltire, the thistle, those emblems were generally not used, especially not in the Navy. There's a modern-day shore establishment in the contemporary Royal Navy called HMS Caledonia. It's a training facility in Scotland. It has a coat of arms that has the saltire and the thistle, but I don't think that would have been anything real that Stephen could have set his eye on. Anyhow, Mike, these two are unreliable interpreters of the view before them. What else is in the scene here for us to think about and pick over?
Well, we started with praying mantises back in Master and Commander. The personification of animals, one of his favorite devices. We've got moths and caterpillars munching away on the crops. We've got a moth destroying beehives. We have a cow, as you said, Ian, which can be spelled Metaphor, that heifer, which refuses the bull and does not give them milk. It's kind of this, all the dreams that we have, but that are actually dry at the moment here, all conspiring against Jack's plan for a rural paradise. And there's even a Virgil reference hidden behind Stephen's analysis of the fell wax moth, this, the demise on Stephen's gift of bees here. So Jack's seed literally is not growing to fruition seemingly anymore. Hold that thought.
Right. And speaking of animals and decay and neglect, Jack has allowed Stephen's present, the bees that Stephen had sent sometime in the past, he's allowed them to die out, maybe from neglect, maybe from being stung. But Stephen kind of airily doesn't mind. He says, well, I'll find you a new set of bees, bolder ones, as he calls it.
Right.
And there's an interesting question here. What is Jack doing with the gifts that Stephen brings him? Because Stephen's position in this chapter is more or less bringer of bounties of various kinds. And Jack has mishandled the bees, and I wonder if that tells us anything about how he's going to handle the other gifts that Stephen has to bring with him. Hold another thought there. The other thought, by the way, is about the gift that Stephen brought in the form of mushrooms, carefully picked and foraged, delicious mushrooms. They end up on the dung heap as part of Mother Williams dismissing the maid. There's a whole other story in there about how the maid and Stephen are concerned about their character and how Mrs. Williams refuses to see the mushrooms as anything but poison. What else are we reading in the chapter that we're enjoying here?
Well, there's that funny moment where Jack's reading out this list of ships lost at sea, thinking about, our losses really weren't quite as bad as I thought they had been. And I guess it's a little bit of O'Brien's way of catching us up on where we are a little bit, and his pleasure at his old colleague, Captain Goat, Goate, being promoted post captain. Well, of course, this is O'Brien. Goat was a real person. Then there's, after Jack has gone through all this naval world, masculine world and losses, this wrangling with Mother Williams, who completely inserts herself into talking about local women in childbirth. Who's really enduring the danger here, the men at sea or the women at home? And, we could do, I think, an entire episode about female characters, male and female, in this episode here. So, we'll come back in a few minutes and revisit that cow, the heifer, again. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit with Stephen and Jack examining Jack's twin girls.
Yeah, let's do that. Again, the theme of gender and children and family is not going to be far from our minds in this whole chapter. We're still only partway through, Mike. The allusions and the references are still coming thick and fast during this catch-up between Jack and Stephen. Stephen says he's been taking the waters at Bohie, I guess that's how you pronounce it, at Bohie in the Pyrenees, observing some people that he calls the cretins of Bohie. Now, this shows a little flash, I think, of what O'Brien's been up to in the intervening years, because there is a series of sketches called The Cretins of Bohie by Catalan artist Isidro Nonel, who was an important influence on, guess who, Pablo Picasso. Now, and this is 3 years of O'Brien's life. Some of this Picasso stuff has imprinted and found its way onto our pages here. Stephen makes the incorrect and outdated connection between medical cretinism, which is the deficiency of the thyroid associated with being deficient in iodine. He's making the connection between that and low intellectual development, which is not true. Bohi, he says, is largely inhabited by idiots. And speaking of idiots, Jack picks up on the mistake and gets us quickly to another reference and back into some of the naval context for the story here, right?
Right. Jack says he's sick of dealing with the Admiralty, where idiots are also to be found.
Yeah.
And so how O'Brien makes these transitions, I love it. O'Brien writes, look at the Admiralty, and what do you see? A general as First Lord. This is what you see. Would you believe it, Stephen? And the first thing this infernal redcoat does is to take away one of the captain's eighth. He reduces our prize money by a third, which is stark, raving lunacy. And then, quite apart from the idiots in Whitehall, this village has half a dozen. They squeak and gibber in the marketplace. And I'm going, wait, squeak and gibber in the marketplace. Ian, where is this from?
Well, it's a quote from Shakespeare. Wouldn't you know it? Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1.
In the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little ere the mightiest Julius fell, the graves stood tenantless, and the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets. As stars with
So it's not a happy scene, as much of Hamlet is not a happy scene, and it's not a happy illusion for the Admiralty here. Now, Mike, Jack can complain all he likes. It is true that by around this time, we had a general, Henry Phipps, as the First Lord. The First Lords of the Admiralty were destined to be civilians forever after from this point onwards. So the days of Earl St. Vincent and other admirals being given the political job of First Lord of the Admiralty, that was past by now. And this particular First Lord, adding insult to injury, as Jack said, had dropped the captain's share of prize money from 3/8 to 2/8. And this is a painful thing for Jack to reflect on. He desperately wants a ship. He wants the opportunity for prize money. He's got all these mouths to feed. He needs larger living space at home. He has an uphill climb to get there, thanks to this general who's the First Lord. And what a plum position it would be if, I don't know, something in the nature of a Commodore's billet should become available, remembering that anybody bearing a flag is going to swoop in at the end of the book and take even more of Jack's prize money. So a little itsy-bitsy plant there for us to think about Jack, high command, and prize money.
Yeah, so I've got to come back to that scene with the cow here. So Jack and Stephen, Jack's still kind of telling Stephen about the dream of country living and its possibility. And, all the milk, butter, cream, and veal. He says, at least we're kind of looking forward to that. Here's my heifer. And Stephen says, yeah, that heifer doesn't look pregnant to me. She looks, as O'Brien writes, lean, pharaonic, cadaverous. Well, the fact of the matter, Stephen says, Jack staring at the cow, the fact of the matter is she refuses the bull. He is game enough. Oh, Lord, yes, but she will have nothing to say to him. Then he flies into a hellfire passion, bellowing and tearing up the ground, and we go without milk. And I think, okay, boy, oh boy, who are we talking about, Jack? Is this you? Who is this? But then Stephen comes back, and I think this is just such a phenomenal nugget about this whole males, females. So tell us about what Stephen's response to Jack is.
Well, and again, Mike, this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I love it that he's playing some of his authority as being knowledgeable about natural philosophy into a little bit of a dig at Jack. He says, from a philosophical point of view, her behavior, he means the cow, her behavior is logical enough. Reflect upon the continual wearisome pregnancies, the price of a momentary, and I may say aleatory, pleasure. And aleatory here means by chance or random. Reflect, he says, upon the physical discomfort of a full udder. I do not mention the uneasiness of seeing one's offspring turned into a blanc-quette de veau, for this is peculiar to the cow. Were I a female of any kind, I should beg to decline these general cares. And were I in this particular case a heifer, I should certainly choose to remain dry. Yet it must be confessed that from a domestical point of view, celibacy in a cow takes on a different aspect entirely. Here, the general good calls out for teeming loins. Yes, said Jack. It does. I love it. A bit of foreshadowing there for further conversations between Jack and Stephen about men and women and father and daughters. Some more to come on the topic of teeming loins at some point, I expect too.
Right, right. Well, the role of women comes up when Jack shows Stephen his twin baby girls. Jack, who's not sure which twin is which and has no idea of how old they are, his response is, well, they must be quite old. They seem to have been here forever. But he asks Stephen what Stephen thinks of them. And he had said earlier, I'd like you to take a look at them. And he's tapping his forehead significantly, like, are they all right upstairs here? Well, Stephen is watching them thinking, I have no idea about this. But then he sees their incredible reaction when Sophie steps into the room, and he tells Jack that they're going to be all right indeed. They may actually turn out to be a pair of phoenixes, but just be sure not to fling them up in the air because it might confuse their intellect. And women, says Stephen, have a greater need of their intellect than a man. I think this is Stephen trying to say the world is such that guys kind of get by with very little intellect sometimes, and women really need to have it all about. And this is a lot of our story here. But then Stephen chides Jack because there's been this whole conversation where Jack's called them these little swabs. And he says, it's very curious the way you dwell upon their sex. They are your own children for all love, your very flesh. And yet I could almost suppose, and not only from your referring to them as swabs, a disobliging term, that you were disappointed in them merely for being girls. It is, to be sure, a misfortune for them. The Orthodox Jew daily thanks his Maker for not having been born a woman, and we might well echo his gratitude. But I cannot for the life of me see how it affects you. Stephen saying to Jack, your aim being, as I take it, posterity, of vicarious immortality, and for that a girl is, if anything, a better assurance. And I loved that Jack comes back and says, no. This is not at all, Stephen's not catching the way Jack's thinking. Jack is worried that he can be of no use to, as he says, a parcel of girls. He can't set them up in the Navy. He can't even leave them part of his estate. They can't inherit. And right now, he cannot even provide portions for them or dowries. Yeah. So this is Jack saying, no, Stephen, this is not me wanting a boy. This is not boys are better than girls. This is me feeling particularly inadequate to the daughters that I have. And I thought, wow. Yeah. Wow. Jack, I love you.
Oh, I love them both. And he's very delicately, O'Brien, taking us from kind of a knockabout, tongue-in-cheek tone into a much darker place. And by the way, we're going to keep coming back to this idea of the way that O'Brien is writing about women in some respects in this chapter, I think has some particular echoes, but we'll come back to that shortly. There's now a very dark conversation where Jack confesses to Stephen about the lukewarm relationship. He means the physical relationship between him and Sophie. And when Stephen offhandedly says that by the law of averages, the next Aubrey child is likely to be a boy, Jack says, there is no likelihood of another. None at all. You have not been married, Stephen, but I cannot explain. Should never have mentioned it. And then shortly after that, he adds, the trouble is that I had somehow got the wrong notion of marriage. I had thought there was more friendship and confidence and unreserve in it than the case allows. I am not criticizing Sophie in the least degree, you understand, but in the nature of things, the fault is entirely on my side, I am sure. When you're in command, you get so sick of the loneliness of playing the great man and so on that you long to break out of it. But in the nature of things, it don't seem possible. And Jack relapses into silence. What does he mean here? It don't seem possible. He could be talking about a couple of different things. And to help with this a little, I think, Stephen asks if Jack would mind being ordered to sea. And this is a moment where we get Jack being brought back up again out of his dark mood, right, Mike?
Yeah. Jack says, oh, he would kiss the messenger. Jack would love the full pay, the chance for prize money, and he gets this piratical look on his face, and the ability to provide dowries to his daughter. And Jack asks if Stephen has been up to something, and perhaps if he has another surprise waiting with another chance to transport another diplomat. And Stephen asks Jack, how do you come to ask such a simple question? Stephen does not tell Jack, but he does in fact have news. But now we've come up to the part of the chapter where Jack and Stephen have a dinner to eat. So let's take a mid-episode break and then come back and see where all this ends up.
Oh, let's. Welcome back. We hope that you got some sustenance, a little bit like the sustenance that Jack and Stephen and Sophie were hoping for. Now we get to move past the psychodrama of what's happening in the Aubrey family and to talk about what's happening in the world of the Admiralty. Because Stephen, who, as we've kind of known now, at least since Post-Captain, is a valuable volunteer intelligence agent for the Admiralty, has been manipulating the situation, as he has done before to help his friend Jack. He has found a way to secure Jack a new command, and as a way of introducing this, he explains that 4 French frigates are threatening the eastern trade from Mauritius and the neighboring island of La Réunion. Stephen reveals that the command of the 38-gun frigate HMS Boadicea, which is destined to be one of the bigger, if not the biggest, of the ships on this particular station, that the command of the Boadicea had originally been intended for Captain Loveless, which, by the way, is a great name for a captain who we'll never meet. But due to Captain Loveless suffering what he calls an obstinate tenesmus, which means a continual urge to void the bowels or bladder, insert metaphor here. Due to Loveless suffering this terrible incapacity, Stephen, using his position in the world of intelligence in the Admiralty, had managed to have Jack appointed to the command of the Boadicea instead, arguing to the Admiralty that Jack is well suited on both the naval and the political sides, with Stephen present as Jack's and the proposed governor's political and military aid for this mission. Now, that's not all, Mike. Stephen announced that Jack would likely be elevated to the status of Commodore. And a Commodore is a temporary appointment. It's an appointment, not a permanent career rank. It's equivalent to being an acting temporary unpaid rear admiral, as Jack describes it. And Stephen pretends not to realize that this is a big deal, but this instantly revives Jack, right, Mike?
Yeah, this is great. And we're having this conversation, by the way, the next day. So after the dinner, when word has come from Lady Clonfert that she desires Jack to give her passage in his ship. And Jack's like, well, if I ever had a ship, I'd be happy to give her a ride. But Lady Clonfert is like trying to come by and see them. And Stephen has to jerk Jack out of the house and say, tell him what's going on, and which he does. And there's this great interaction between Stephen and Jack. So I'll jump into the first part and then let you come back here if it would be okay. And Stephen say, so he's explaining how, boy, loose lips sinks ships and, all this horrible stuff that obviously the news, he wants it to come in through formal channels. That is why, Stephen says, I'm most unwillingly obliged to give you this short summary. In any other event, I should infinitely have preferred the news to reach you through the proper channels without the least explanation. Your provisional orders are at the Port Admiral's office this minute. For not only does this require speaking openly of what should not be mentioned at all, but I'm extremely adverse to appearing in the role of fairy godmother, a purely fortuitous fairy godmother in this case. It can inflict an apparent, though fallacious, burden of obligation and cause great damage to a relationship. So this is Stephen going, no, I don't want to have this and have this change our relationship. Jack replies, not to ours, brother, said Jack. Not to ours. And I will not thank you since you don't like it. But Lord Stephen, I am a different man. O'Brien says he was indeed taller, younger, pinker, his eyes blazing with life. His stoop had gone, and his great boyish grin kept ruining his attempted gravity. And then
Oh.
Stephen continues.
He can see that he's now got a tiger by the tail in this revived character of Jack Aubrey.
Yeah.
He says, "You will not mention this to Sophie nor to any other person," with a cold, penetrating glare. "Must I not even start looking to my sea chest?" asks Jack. "What a fellow you are, Jack. Of course you must not until the Port Admiral's messenger is come. Cannot you see the obvious cause and effect? I should have thought it plain even to the meanest intelligence." And Jack is a very mean intelligence at this point. His brain is full of joy. "A ship!" cried Jack, springing heavily into the air. There were tears in his eyes, and Stephen saw that he might wish to shake hands at any minute. And this is Stephen's distaste for the emotional overindulgences of the English, right?
Right. And, it's such a great scene. So awesome. And Jack is beaming. He can't help himself. So Stephen says, all right, you're not going back in to see Sophie right now because she's going to see it. You're as transparent as a bride. So Stephen says, I'm going to go in. I'm going to have Sophie right back to Lady Clonfert. You're going to stay out here and get your act together. And the chapter then concludes with the arrival of the Port Admiral's messenger and the complications of Lady Clonfert, the wife of Jack's future subordinate, Captain Lord Clonfert, who visits Ashgrove Cottage seeking passage to the Cape. And Jack promises to carry her, but his cordiality is, O'Brien says, sensibly diminished when he catches Stephen's anxious glance, realizing that Sophie has now kind of gotten jealous. And we have this great, go back and reread the scene, this great thing of how Lady Clonfert is trying to position herself to appear to Jack's masculinity while also, appealing to Sophie, like, don't be worried about me. But finally, Jack says, well, my immediate next step is I'm going to go join the ship. You, Lady Clonfert, should take down and join us. You don't need to do the sea voyage on this part here. We'll pick you up later. And I need to get out of here because I got to get on board tonight. And Sophie responds by producing all these domestic reasons and naval reasons why he really can't depart that evening, indicating that she's really distressed by his sudden return to active dangerous service right this minute. I think she's willing to give him up, but not right this minute.
Right. And you can kind of feel Jack's desire to get away, partly to get away so that he can get on with his new naval opportunity, partly to get away from the awkwardness between his wife and his mother-in-law and this woman, Lady Clonfert.
Right.
And he's torn between rushing to his ship and staying with his wife. And this is going to be an important resolution for us here. It's witnessed by Stephen at the very end of the chapter. So here are the closing words of chapter 1 of the Mauritius Command. Stephen communed with his horse in its outhouse for a while, and when he came back, he found Jack at the door, staring up at the scudding clouds, with Sophie looking exceptionally beautiful in her anxiety and emotion beside him. "The glass is rising," said Jack thoughtfully, "but the wind is still due south, and when you consider where she lays right up the harbour, there is not a hope of getting her out on this tide. No, my dear, perhaps you are right. Perhaps I should not go aboard until tomorrow." "But tomorrow, sweetheart," he said, looking fondly down, "tomorrow, at the crack of dawn, you lose your husband to his natural element." Aha, very good. Jack staying ashore one extra night might turn out to have consequences that reach far ahead. Talk about a plant and a payoff, if you get my meaning.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, what kind of environment is Jack heading into? I think we're getting a few clues here with the arrival of Lady Clonfert as the first connection to the Indian Ocean as a theater of war. Gives us a hint that life in the colonies was about this social world of expats, officers' wives, governors, merchants. It's all about that as much as it is about topmen and frigate captains here.
Right.
We're going to find out in later episodes the Indian Ocean theater was a real stew pot of rivalries, shifting political alliances, grudges, and injustices. So dealing delicately with Lady Clonfert is just the beginning.
Right.
You know, as I think you alluded to at the beginning of the chapter, the Black Hole of Calcutta may be long past, but Calcutta and the Indian Ocean are no place for people with a faint heart or a weak constitution, as Canning found out in HMS Surprise.
Right. So, Mike, again, you and I have said to each other many, many times as we've been preparing this episode, oh, isn't it great to be back? Isn't it just like being back home with these characters and with each other and with the listeners? But let's talk for a second about what's similar and what's different from previous books, because there is something about the Mauritius Command, like we said, that kind of divides people a little bit. But what are we getting and what are we missing?
Well, what's similar is that Jack is all at sea when he's ashore. So, that's similar. And that he and his particular friend are as close and intimate as ever. So we've got that. That's a continuation.
Right. We also have the continuation that we've already mentioned of the historical basis printing through. The real historical timeline, the context of the British forces in the Indian Ocean and the Cape of Good Hope is being portrayed just as faithfully here as the Cochrane story and the Battle of Algeciras had been portrayed in Master and Commander. So that's familiar O'Brien territory, right? And for those of us who love the naval history context of the stories, that's going to feature strongly for us, and we're going to enjoy digging into that in later episodes. But there are some discontinuities as well. What the heck happened to Jack Aubrey between 1802 and 1808? Just as O'Brien spent those years pursuing his biography of Picasso, Aubrey, and we guess also Maturin, have spent years doing other things. And we missed, the Battle of Trafalgar, loads of other naval action in the War of the First Coalition. Loads of interesting things happened to Thomas Cochrane in those years. But O'Brien has chosen to separate Aubrey's timelines from Cochrane's and to skip ahead past some of the busiest years of the history of the Royal Navy. And you've got to wonder, Mike, why that is.
Yeah, I absolutely wonder, is it that, O'Brien's got some specific idea for taking the stories in a different direction? Does he, just want to cleanse his palate? Is he ready for a new re-energized set of Aubrey Maturin tales with a specific arc to them? Yeah. Maybe he was a little unsure about whether the public and the critics were really with him and set about writing in a slightly detached frame of mind. Not too worried about placing his book and his characters in a context that carried on directly from the prior three.
Yeah. There's another discontinuity, and that's the absence of any mention of Diana in this opening chapter. You and I have mentioned her many more times in our discussion than O'Brien is going to mention her, spoilers, many more times than he is going to mention her in the entire book. And the previous two books had strong female characters and a positively 20th century feminist point of view on display. We had it a little here in this chapter with the jokes about the cow refusing the bull, but actually quite a lot of negative reflection, negative attitudes of men towards women. The women are a drag on Jack Aubrey's life. And we've got to wonder why that could be. And like I say, Mike, spoiler, but hardly any female characters at all are going to appear in this book now that we've got to the end of chapter 1. And that's a big step away, I think, from the O'Brien world of Post-Captain and HMS Surprise.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Ian. No Villers, the whole thing going on with men and women here in chapter 1, when we're actually not going to come back to female characters pretty much at all the rest of the book here, and why we don't know of any particular signs of problems in O'Brien's marriage to Mary. We've talked about Mary at the end of the canon and how big an influence she was throughout, but perhaps there are some clues in the subject matter that had been occupying O'Brien's mind in his thinking and writing for a few years prior to writing this.
Right. This is why we made a big deal out of mentioning the Picasso biography at the beginning. Because if you look into the critical appreciations or not of O'Brien's Picasso biography, it becomes clear that O'Brien had immersed himself in the life and you could say the attitudes of Picasso. And Norman Mailer wrote that no man loved and hated women more than Picasso. He was pretty clearly shown to be misogynistic in general and cruel to lots of the women that he formed relationships with. And you could say that O'Brien had refrained from showing the misogyny of Picasso in a critical light, and that in the biography he had expressed negative opinions about women and children. And interestingly, at one point in the Picasso biography that O'Brien wrote, on his own behalf, he wrote, "Until babies reach the human stage, they are so alike that they can hardly be told apart," which kind of sounds a lot like Jack Aubrey talking about his daughters. And Mike, I think that maybe O'Brien had just gotten carried away with being in Picasso world, and this carried over into at least the opening chapter of the Mauritius Command. Now, it might be interesting for our listeners to share with us what they think about this aspect of the book or any aspect of the books. So, Mike, let me take a moment here to say, folks, if you're with us and you're enjoying being back with the Lubber's Hole, then please join us on our social media channels. You can find us on Facebook. Look for the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You can find us on Twitter, or X as it is now called. We are at Hole Lubbers. We're on YouTube. We also have a Patreon membership. And if you'd like to contribute to the growth of the show, to get ad-free episodes and to get special insider info about what's happening with the production of the show, you can find us over on patreon.com/lubbershole. And we'd love to have you on board with us. Our Patreon community were a massive help to us in getting the original iterations of the show off the ground. And we've got lots more that we'd like to share with the new generation of our Patreon supporters here.
Yeah. And I guess that just leaves us with some questions as we turn the page to the next chapter of the Mauritius Command. So what's going on with Stephen, apart from being the fairy spy father to Jack? We've heard about the names of some of the commanders in Jack's squadron. We didn't go into detail here, but you read about them in chapter 1. So how is Jack going to fare as a commander of commanders for the first time? And what about admirals? We don't have Hart. We don't have Keith. We don't have St. Vincent. And of course, we can't help but wonder, as Stephen has already started thinking about in chapter 1, the exotic natural delights that await him in the Indian Ocean. So, Ian, what do you say next time to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brien?
Mike, my old friend, I should like that of all things.